Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Your Legislators on KRWG Public Media. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. On this program, we talk with state lawmakers from our viewing area during the legislative session in New Mexico. This week, our guest is New Mexico Democratic State Representative of District 35 in Las Cruces, Angelica Rubio. Representative Rubio, thank you so much for joining us on Your Legislators.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Anthony.
Now, I'd like to start off talking about a major issue that is being discussed in the state legislature. You're helping lead that effort, and that is paid sick leave in New Mexico. Let's start off by talking about this bill that you're sponsoring. What we know of paid sick leave is at least 13 states in the country and Washington, D.C. have a paid sick leave policy in place. Our neighboring states, Arizona has a paid sick leave policy, and Colorado, looking at Arizona, we know that private sector employees and local government employees are covered. This law in Arizona provides 1 hour of sick leave for every 30 hours work, a max of 40 per year. In Colorado, there is an hour paid sick leave for every 30 hours worked, a max of 48 hours per year. Now, employers may actually grant additional paid sick leave there in Colorado if they so choose, and there was also an executive order that was passed for emergency paid sick leave due to COVID-19. I want to hear about how the pandemic may be impacting the chances of this bill. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So yes, New Mexico for the first time is going to be considering paid sick leave here in the state of New Mexico. For us, it's a really straightforward piece of legislation. It's House Bill 37, and it actually has its first hearing tomorrow, and it would address issues related to coverage, accrual, usage, and enforcement, and very similar to what you just described in both Colorado and Arizona. To just keep, for folks who are listening, paid sick leave isn't an addition. It isn't additional benefits. It is just, that's why we call it earned paid sick leave, because a person has worked the time to be able to take the time off. But right now, with the way that COVID has impacted essential workers, especially, a lot of folks have had to choose between a paycheck and staying home and staying safe. And so this bill is not only legislation and policy that we've been trying to work through local communities for several years now, but we feel because at the height of COVID and what we've experienced so far, that this is the best time to get it done.
Now, obviously, there's some challenges. There's been communities across the state that have tried similar pieces of legislation, but they haven't been able to get it passed. At the statewide level, there may be some challenges from the business community. Some corporations may be able to handle this, but what about the small business owner who is already struggling to get through the pandemic? How do you plan to help that business owner be able to implement a plan like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question. And unfortunately, what's happened over the course of the last few years, and you've seen it here locally, is that you've had small businesses being pitted against workers and vice versa, except that what this legislation does, and a lot of different other pieces of legislation are trying to do in the legislature, is address both. And I think when we're talking about paid sick leave and earning paid sick leave, this isn't something extra that the small businesses will have to provide. This is, like I mentioned, this isn't an added benefit. These are hours that a worker has earned to be able to take off. And so when we're talking about how small businesses will be impacted, it's important for folks to understand that the chances of the success of a small business is based on the health of their employees, and the and this is why the paid sick leave bill is so important. We are, of course, going to have that debate in committee tomorrow, as well as this bill progresses. But I think this bill is one of many that are being addressed in the legislature to not only support and impact workers, but also really help to infuse and stimulate the small business economy throughout the state of New Mexico.
So is there anything that you think the state could possibly do to help out some of these small businesses who may be wanting to get on board with this, but when it comes down to the bottom line, they just don't have the funds to make it happen?
Yeah, so the state right now, within the state legislature, there are a number of issues that are being considered by other legislators that will impact small businesses outside of just this legislation. I think what what is important for this paid sick leave bill is that this bill doesn't solve all of our issues, and it shouldn't. It should be much more comprehensive and robust. And there are a number of other pieces of legislation that go hand in hand with this piece of legislation that will not only just address the workers piece, which is what we're trying to do, but also other pieces of legislation that will work towards supporting small businesses in the long run, especially as we think about recovery.
So right now in New Mexico, what exists for a person who may be facing that challenge of they're not feeling well, they may be sick, but they're not going to get paid if they don't go to work? What is in place right now to help that worker?
Right now, it's limited. I mean, for folks who I've received a number of direct messages, phone calls, people who've reached out on social media, who have been and were very afraid to go to work because they didn't have the ability to just call in and stay home. Like, those benefits don't actually exist for many workers. And I mean, there are, especially when we're talking about the essential workers who work in the restaurant industry, or are domestic workers, or part-time seasonal. All of the folks that we are including in the coverage of the paid sick leave are the people who have been left out of this whole process. People who are delivering our food when we order food, they are not covered by this. And so many times, and it's not just something that we say just to say, but it's true. There are people who are choosing to go into work sick, many of them with COVID, because they can't afford to stay home. And right now, within the state of New Mexico, within our local municipalities, there's very little support for workers to be able to adhere to that. The paid sick leave bill would also really make it so that it would have to be enforced. The state, a worker could use their own right of action to be able to address these issues, which doesn't exist right now.
Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but do you feel that the momentum due to the pandemic may actually change some minds on this piece of legislation in regards to offering paid sick leave in New Mexico?
I mean, I'm being optimistic about it. There are two paid sick leave bills. One is House Bill 20, which is being led by Representative Christine Chandler and Damon Eli. And then, of course, this one, which is House Bill 37. Both bills have very little differences. And but both myself and the other sponsors, we are determined that New Mexico will have a paid sick leave bill sent to the governor's office at the end of this session.
Okay, so what are your thoughts, though? Do you think it's actually going to be able to pass the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I am there's the thing is that it's one to just talk and defend essential workers and say all of these things about how we need to protect them. But if we're not doing it through public policy, that is actually one, beneficial in the now, but also could be very transformative for communities in the future. I mean, we need to just stop talking about it and actually do it. And so this is the challenge that I'm putting up for the New Mexico State Legislature, is that if we're going to defend essential workers and say that we're fighting for them, then this is one way to do that.
Okay, now I want to move on and talk about another issue facing state lawmakers this legislative session, and that is housing challenges in New Mexico. Already there's been some challenges in the state, but COVID-19 has certainly impacted those challenges negatively. I want to talk with you about some data we came across. Over 3,200 people may be experiencing homelessness on any given day in New Mexico. That's according to data from 2018 from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. Now, of that 3,200 people on an everyday basis, over 250 were veterans, over 240 were family households, and over 200 were unaccompanied young adults aged 18 through 24. Over 1,400 were experiencing chronic homelessness out of that number. How bad is the housing issue in New Mexico now with the pandemic piled on top of it?
Yeah, I mean, the housing issues before COVID-19 were already pretty bad. New Mexico was ranked pretty high in terms of access to shelter. And Representative Andrea Romero and myself were we're listening into one of our caucus meetings back in the spring when the governor had just first issued the stay-at-home order. And what her and I were the only ones that seemed to be talking about housing. Here we were asking and telling people that they needed to stay home. And yet there were people who were losing their shelter even before COVID. And so the bill that we're introducing is House Bill 111, which would modernize a lot of the housing and tenant issues that many have not only been facing before COVID, but that need to be addressed immediately under this current COVID-19 situation.
Okay. So you're telling me that this was in a Democratic caucus. The Democrats control the state legislature right now. New Mexico's been one of the poorest states in the country for decades. We know that. And you're telling me only two state lawmakers, Democratic state lawmakers, were talking about housing issues even after the pandemic?
Well, once as the pandemic was starting, yes.
Okay. Tell me more about this bill and how you think it can actually do something to provide some help for folks who are facing this issue of possibly not having a roof over their head.
Yeah. So House Bill 111 has been a legislation that we've been working on for the last 10 months. This housing working group has been meeting every Friday, and really to address really just uniformity issues that had led to gaps for both landlords and for renters. And so some of it had to do with like payment of rent. So it's a long list of things that we're trying to address to really fill the gaps. But one of the biggest issues that I wanted to address, and this bill will address, is that sometimes when renters, especially if they're on Section 8, for example, their vouchers weren't seen as income. And so many were denied the opportunity to rent housing because they just didn't have sufficient income. So their voucher wasn't actually counting. We are trying to address things like that, including issues related to evictions. There used to be a renter only had up to 3 days to appeal. We're asking for 10 days. So it's like little things like that, which overall we feel are not an incredible overhaul to the housing issues here in New Mexico, but at least begin to make the necessary steps necessary to really address these issues. We're also looking within this bill, House Bill 111, to create a council. Right now, the state of New Mexico, and this isn't just for New Mexico, but this is all across the country, states don't have a designated person or entity overseeing housing. And so we are trying to create a council here in New Mexico that will coordinate with folks like CYFD. Right now with Secretary Block, he's working with us on an amendment to this legislation because people are starting to see and have been seeing, I mean, don't get me wrong, people have been working on this issue for a very long time, but there's a lot of correlation between housing and education, housing and economic development, housing and child welfare. And the reason that it's so important, and I'm glad that you seemed as outraged around this issue around housing and our leadership, is because that's why representation matters. That's why we need elected officials who are connected to our communities to fully understand what is happening, because housing and shelter in the midst of a pandemic where we're being asked and told to stay home should be a number one priority. And evictions have continued to take place. Unfortunately, even after the Supreme Court here in New Mexico ruled that there needed to be a stay on evictions. I know that the former administration issued one as well, but evictions are still happening, and it's because of the lack of communication really within what's happening, the realities that are taking place on the ground, and the folks in our judiciary who are still not really translating the law and the realities in the way that I believe they should be.
Okay, now you say evictions are still happening in the state. Now, this is even after the governor has issued rules to protect renters who may be struggling financially so that they can keep a roof over their head. How are evictions even happening? What are you hearing?
Yeah, evictions are happening. So a lot of what we're hearing is that one, notices that are going to a lot of the notices folks are having to report. Initially, folks were having to report in person, which was really hard to do, especially with COVID. There hadn't been a setup for to do things telephonically or via Zoom or whatever. But then you also have when things started to transition to having things done telephonically or by computer. A lot of folks, believe it or not, don't have a spiffy iPhone or a phone that actually can provide the kind of technology that most people need during these times. So it was really a lack of technology to be able to tap into something. And then it was in the order in which cases were being heard. So many cases, people didn't have minutes, for example, in their phones to be able to sit in line waiting for their case to be called. And so evictions were just happening very rapidly. And there was also just a disconnect also within landlords not receiving the information. So for example, the Mortgage Finance Authority here for the state of New Mexico not only received funding from the CARES Act, which is the federal stimulus package from last spring, but some of the money that we provided to the Mortgage Finance Authority through the special sessions, or the block grants that were provided, landlords were not responding to the communication that was being done to tell folks that there was money available to help cover any rent, and even any missed payments on the side of the landlords. So landlords were evicting without really responding to the fact that there was funding out there and available. And part of the reason is why this council that's embedded in this House Bill 111 is so critical, is because we hope it will help to alleviate a lot of the gaps that exist within entities that need to communicate with each other in order to keep people in their homes.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to following up with you on that issue. Obviously, it impacts many people in the state. I want to talk about another piece of legislation you're working on, and that is the Prescription Drug Affordability Act. What can you tell us about this bill and how you think it can make an impact for New Mexicans?
Yeah, so this issue is really actually brand new to me. I didn't even realize that over 40% of New Mexicans, which is very high for the country, were deferring on their drugs and the medications that they were needing to take in order to pay their bills. And this was a really, really high number for me. And so some of the advocates came with a model that has been utilized in other parts of the state, of the country. And it's essentially like our Public Regulations Commission. Many of us are familiar with the PRC. They're the ones that regulate our utility companies and other consumer protected related institutions. And the what we're calling the PDAB, which is the Prescription Drug Affordability Board, this would essentially do that. Right now, the prescription drug companies are the only businesses in the healthcare industry whose rates are not regulated. And so the PDAB would be this independent board made up here in the state of New Mexico that would essentially do that. And so we have a lot of confidence in this legislation. It was just introduced on Monday. And because of last year, folks followed that legislative session in 2020, where we were actually able to cap insulin so that it wouldn't go above $25 for New Mexicans. We felt that there was some momentum to actually get this going based on what happened last year. And so we're feeling pretty confident that we might be able to make this affordability board a reality.
Okay, another piece of legislation you are working on is addressing a possible private detention facility moratorium. Can you share with me a little bit about why you felt this piece of legislation is necessary?
Yeah, so the issue related to private prisons here in the state of New Mexico goes as far back as the 1990s, where we invested in private prisons as an opportunity to, one, address the rise in the need for prisons because of the riot that took place back in, for folks who aren't familiar with it, there was a huge riot that led to this. We are one of the last states that remains with the most private prisons in the country. We have about 7. And the reason that I'm addressing this issue is because since serving in the New Mexico State Legislature, I've come to the realization that not only are we heavily reliant on oil and gas, for example, but we're also very reliant on exploitative industries like the private prison industry. And so if we're really being honest with ourselves about how we need to diversify our economy here in New Mexico, I believe that we need to do it both in a way that is both sustainable and non-exploitative. And for me, doing this moratorium and eventually an end to private prisons is a step of getting us closer to that.
Well, if that should happen, I mean, what about the folks who live in rural communities in New Mexico where the prison facility may be their best source of getting a decent paying job in the area? I mean, what do you have planned to help out for those people in those counties who may be depending on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. And I think it's one that why I call these industries exploitative is because this is the kind of dependency that we have really forced many communities to really have to rely on. And so this legislation it would be a 3 to 5 year process in terms of our transition. We also intend to have a transition plan in place to be able to support communities to have a plan to transition away and bring in other opportunities. I know that tomorrow we are introducing legislation to address a number of issues related to workforce development and a just transition that I've been working on. And I feel like there's legislation that is being considered at this upcoming session that works in hand with each other. I mean, the legislation that I decided to carry this year is, I think, there's so many intersections between them all. And so they're not just standalone bills that I feel will solve all the problems, but I feel like they work in combination with a number of things that we are working on as a legislative branch.
Now, I want to talk with you about more issues that we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, the lack of broadband infrastructure in New Mexico has gained a lot of attention. The governor brought that up in her recent State of the State address and wanted more funding for that. We're seeing how that has affected people as many are working from home and learning from home across New Mexico. One issue that I've talked with you about before has been the issue of paying state lawmakers. I bring this up because with so many issues facing our state, with the pandemic facing our state, we've already had special sessions in New Mexico. Where are you with this issue right now? And is it even being talked about in the state legislature about how the legislature even works?
Yeah. It's a great question. Honestly, it's one that I ponder each and every single day that I serve in the legislature, because this work is not easy. One, we don't get paid to do the hours upon hours of work that we're expected to do, and then there are just some legislators that don't do anything. They just go up to Santa Fe, or they do their legislative duty during the session, and then they're done. But the bottom line is that there are issues that New Mexicans face every single day, and the fact that we don't have a legislature that is addressing these issues every single day, I believe, is a direct correlation as to why we rank so low in so many different areas. Um, we have an opportunity, and this is how I've come into this legislative session, even despite COVID, even despite having to do this virtually and having a limited amount of time up in Santa Fe, is that um, this could potentially be a very transformative legislative session if we are actually grounded on this notion that in the ways that we need to address in the way that communities are having to address their own lives and their own situations, we need a legislative branch that is going to be just as effective. And my plan, hopefully, depending on how the session turns out, because every single day it's different with COVID, is that there is already legislation ready to go that would create a task force that would really work towards implementing things that have already been brought to that have already been what we already know will work here in the state of New Mexico in terms of how we modernize our legislature. It's just a matter of getting legislators to understand that there are these direct correlations, and getting them to support something that may not seem meaningful right now because of the pandemic that we're in, but would have long-lasting effects in making sure that New Mexico gets into a better direction moving forward.
All right, now we'll obviously follow up with you on that issue as the state faces 21st century problems. Angelica Rubio, she is a state representative for District 35 in New Mexico. I want to thank you so much for joining us on Your Legislators.
You're welcome. Thanks, Anthony.
And of course, we want to thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. I'm Anthony Morneau. Thank you for being here.